Hello, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, you're great.
I need to blow my nose.
Need a tissue?
Yeah, I need a tissue. Thank you, Adrian.
You are welcome.
Oh, thank you.
Good afternoon. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the First Presbyterian Church of Brooklyn. I'm Adrienne Thorne, the senior minister here, and we're really delighted to have you here for this celebration of the arts and photography. So if you are joining us in the virtual space, welcome to you as well, and also welcome to those who are here in person. So this afternoon, we're going to have a conversation, and that conversation is going to be led by Patricia Wattwood. She will direct our conversation this afternoon. Patty, as we call her, is a leading figure in the contemporary figurative realist movement. She's known for her classical paintings, drawings, and portraits in oil. Her narrative subjects are primarily women, with themes of allegory, myth, and archetype. Her portrait of Ida B. Wells was commissioned by the Kennedy School at Harvard. Wattwood has been exhibited at the Beijing World Art Museum, the European Museum of Modern Art, the Butler Museum, and is in the collections of the St. Louis University Museum of Art and the New Britain Museum of American Art. Patty is the first vice president of the Salmagundi Club of New York. Her first book, The Path of Drawing, is coming out with Monticelli Studio Press later this year. Elder Patty, as we know her here at First Church, will be in dialogue today with the renowned and illustrious photographer, Chester Higgins, Jr. Wrestling with issues of memory, place, and identity, Chester Higgins sees his life as a narrative and his photography as its expression. His art gives visual voice to his personal and collective memories. It is inside the ordinary moments where Mr. Higgins finds windows into larger meaning. Light, perspective, and points in time are the pivotal elements he has used over a decades-long career to reveal an interior presence within his subjects as he searches for what he identifies as the signature of the spirit. Mr. Higgins is in the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art here in New York City, the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco, the New York Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., the New York Public Library Schomburg Center, the Jewish Museum here in New York, the Birmingham Civil Rights Museum in Alabama, the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, and the New York Historical Society, just to name a few. He's also in the collections of private individuals, businesses, and institutions. First Presbyterian Church of Brooklyn is delighted to welcome an alumni of Tuskegee University, a mentee of Gordon Parks and Rumar Bearden, a former New York Times staff photographer, a member of the Egyptological Seminar of New York, as well as the Sudan Archaeological Research Society, and the American Research Center in Egypt. Chester Higgins is a public speaker, a published author, and a human within whom Africa has been born. He's here to discuss his latest book, Sacred Nile. Please let's welcome him with all our love and regard, Chester Higgins, Jr.
Thank you.
So hi, I'm Elder Patty Wattwood, and I'm glad to be here, and I thank you all for coming. We're going to spend about an hour looking at Chester's work and learning from him about Sacred Nile and other topics around creativity and the photography that he's doing. We're going to have questions and answers at the end. So if you have a question, you're invited to write it down, or there will be microphones who'd love to hear your questions. If you're joining us in the virtual space, there'll be a chat that's at chat.fpc.church, and you can follow along the chat with other people who are watching online. If you're watching from our fpc.church website, it's the chat that's there. If you happen to be watching from Facebook, we are not monitoring the chat on that site, so please go to chat.fpc.church to participate if you want to ask a question for the end, and I will be looking at that. So I want to thank Chester Higgins. I've been doing a deep dive learning about your life, and I am a painter and no expert in photography nor Egypt. But I was really inspired to talk to you because it became clear in learning about your work that one of the things that we share in our art making is a sense that we are spiritual beings having a human experience, and that our work is an expression of call. And that call to our spiritual work just happens to take us on a journey into visual art and creativity. So I think that's the point of commonality from which I am going to be drawing out questions. Here we are at First Presbyterian Church of Brooklyn, a church one of whose missions is to be an intentionally diverse and multicultural space, and it is Black History Month. So it's our privilege as the congregation and as an elder here at the church to host this conversation. And I hope that all of you will think of FPC, of First Church Brooklyn, as a place where we have ongoing conversations about human connections and diversity in our world. So thank you for being a part of that here.
Thank you.
Your work digs into the history of culture, religion, and aesthetics, particularly in ancient Egypt. But we're going to talk a bit about the common roots of religion from Egypt to then things that we experience here in this congregation, and then the history of faith and religion themselves in that. So Chester Higgins is an award-winning journalist. As Adrian introduced, his work as a journalist for the New York Times spanned 4 decades of important American history and recorded Jim Crow South, your experience in the Black universities and at Tuskegee, and then here in New York as a journalist photographing luminaries like Aretha Franklin and Ozzie Davis and Muhammad Ali, and just to list just a few. But then, so you've done all of that important journalistic work, but now you are very much more focused on this spiritual path. You grew up in New Brockton, Alabama, and in his memoir, Echoes of the Spirit, which I highly recommend, he recalls waking in the middle of the night to a vision of a Black man in ancient clothing. The figure meditated and then began to move towards you. He said, "I come for you." And then you spent years in youth ministry, but eventually moved to photography. So my question is, I'd love to hear you talk about that experience and your sense of call and how it brought you to photography.
Thank you. First, giving honor to the Almighty for being here, such a beautiful space. Thank you for the invitation. You know, I was, at 9 years old, I was your regular kid who got in trouble and about everything. And religion was the last thing on my mind because I think as a child, you sort of see religion as something that's very constrictive. You got to sit and you got to be quiet for the whole service. And I had this apparition that night, and it really changed I grew up almost immediately in a way. Actually, what I thought it was, I thought it was the angel of death coming for me. but I survived that. And my grandfather put a Bible in my hand, and I started reading the Bible for the first time. You know, up until then, I think as a child, when we always had to say grace, children wanted to find out the shortest scripture. So the shortest scripture was Jesus wept. So I immediately went from Jesus wept to now reading throughout the Bible and taking to the Bible like fish to water. But what I think that experience really taught me, it gave me a glimpse that there was a parallel universe. And it sort of made me not take myself too seriously, because there was this other thing that was around and I couldn't figure it out, but I knew it was there, it was lurking. And it made me sort of become, I guess, bifocal in a way. It's probably the best way of looking at it, because I started to see what I saw, but I started to intuit or feel that what I saw became really like the surface of what was there. Over time, I began to be able to find the words for that, but in terms of saying that we're all a part, and we're all a part of this big something, this big oneness, and we are it and it is us. But as a child, that's not how I didn't have those words, but I had the understanding that somehow what I was looking at was only half of the story. And then, but that vision or that apparition made me comfortable with the other half. I didn't feel that it was spooky or scary or demonic. And so I saw it in a positive way. I saw it as something that was a companion, that we were a companion to each other. And it made me sort of open my eyes to possibility that there could be more, and it's all right to comprehend that there is more, even though I may not know how to define it, how to describe it. And that has, and that and the combination with being a child minister is when adults begin to treat me as an adult because of my connection to the Spirit. My peers begin to venture far away from me because I wasn't doing what they were doing. And so I missed out a lot. I didn't realize this until after my divorce and in therapy, that the one thing about being a minister was that it denied me of my teenagehood. So I didn't get a chance to do all the things that all my friends were doing because it just didn't occur to me I should be doing it. And so I became quite boring to them. And that was okay. And then I went to school and at Tuskegee, and I walked away because I wanted to live a life. I didn't know how words for it then, but I wanted to live a life where I could associate with my age group, and that there would not be a wall between them and me. And so then I told no one that I'd been a minister. I reached out to no church to be a part of their thing because I wanted to experience a normal life at 19. But I think even though I didn't think about that, it took me years later to realize once I started, when I became a photographer, then it became apparent to me what I was doing. That I was looking at what was obvious, but I was also very interested in what was behind it.
Right. So you told me about, as you spent these years as a photographer and journalist, where we sort of, in our society, we think of maybe the roles of artist or the role of photographer. They're largely could be considered secular roles, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in ancient times, and this is another thing I want to circle back to, that the role of artist in society was actually much more closely aligned to that of priest or priestess, ritual maker, right? That they were actually seen as much more the same sphere as opposed to separate spheres. So in this society, you sort of take on this identity as artist or photographer, journalist, But then you, at a certain point, and we taught you, your mentorship with Romare Bearden was when you really started to think about the development of self, that the art we make is actually another means of spiritual development. So, and you had some nice metaphors for that. I'd love you to tell a little bit about that experience of when you started to think of yourself as an artist exploring.
Well, two things happened. Romy suggested two things. One, Romy would hold these Saturday sessions for artists to come. I was the only one who was not an artist like you. I was a photographer. And he would look at our work and talk about it. And he would begin to tell me, he said, well, you know, you have to dig deeper. You have to think of yourself as a miner, digging a hole. And the deeper, and you have to get rid of a lot of stuff to get to the source, to get to the core. And you do that by digging deeper, because the more you dig, you have to throw out the junk. And as the closer and deeper you get to yourself, you got a lot of junk that you've thrown out. So for me, I thought that was very eye-opening. And then he said, you know, another point, he said, well, you know, you have to learn how to Zen your art. And I said, well, how do I do that? He said, well, you got to think about what's a natural element that you, that is you, that you feel that is you.
Something that's a bit easeful, something that comes naturally to you?
Well, yes. So I thought about it for a couple of weeks, and I finally said to Romy, I said, well, I think that the element for me is water. Because one of the things that in this craft of photography, in photography in the world, there's this tendency to stop the moment. And the photographer becomes the subject, becomes the point of attraction for the subject. And to me, I realized that that was not what I wanted, because that meant I was not able to look around the corner behind the person, and also the viewer can't appreciate the picture as much as when the person is looking directly back at you. So I thought water worked for me, because water is something that it moves with very little resistance. The viscosity is very good. And then so it can go in and out and around things and not disturb the moment. And I did not want to disturb the moment. I wanted to capture the moment. I'm not what's important. It's the spirit that connects us all that's important. And I cannot capture the spirit if the carrier of the spirit is focused on me. And then he said, you know, you have to learn how to Zen the archer with a bow and arrow. And you look at the target, and when you and the target becomes one, it's when you release the arrow. So photographically, when I and the target, that thing that is in front of me that I'm trying to capture, there's always this thing that I am it, and it is me, in order for the picture to happen.
That's amazing. Yeah, and we are all connected through a greater spirit, a spirit that is greater than ourselves.
And when we move in that way, it forces us, first of all, to drop ego, right, because ego is a barrier, and then to accept and embrace each other as cousins, as part of this whole experience. And that was sort of reinforced by something my great uncle said to me when I was 19, and I was trying to make a decision about college, and he finally said to me, he said, well, whatever you decide, it's important that you make a mark on life, or you can very well die undeclared. Well, for a 19-year-old ego to hear this, it didn't sit well. But it really sort of blew the top off my head, because I thought, wow, not only is he my great uncle, who I love very much, but he's also the caretaker of the cemetery. So he's responding to this on different levels. You look at cemeteries, you walk through and you see what's on the tombstones. And there's only two things on the tombstones, the beginning and the end, the sunrise and the sunset. And everything else in the middle becomes a space. So, and also where I come from, you know, people, their reputation matters. So and that's their mark. I was looking at today, my mentor, my high school social studies teacher, who was a great mentor to me, former Marine, who taught me a lot about fishing, and because, you know, they say the good Lord doesn't charge you for fishing. But he was a guy who sort of helped focus a lot of us students in terms of a mission to be of service to our communities, to be of service to our people. And those things have always been a package. That's a part of what I do, that I am a part of the world, and I'm a part of a particular group that's maligned, but then there's a job to be done. And with that camera, I found out that I could contribute a lot to that. And so in the saying of my great uncle, my camera and my approach to trying to add new information that people do not see or they overlook or is below the radar for them, I hope that's my mark.
It's amazing. So you mentioned that your element is water, and then of course this book that we're here to discuss is the Sacred Nile, which so you sort of took the element of understanding your connection to that metaphorically and then went to the original source of water, right? The biggest element and the cradle of civilization. And you're a tremendous scholar of this entire region. So here is a map for you all watching of the entire region. So what we think of now as the culture of Egypt also includes Sudan, Ethiopia. Those are the large countries, and many other countries in Africa. And so your travels to Africa, originally in 1971 to West Africa, you've been all over the continent, and then 1973 to East Africa. And I would love it if you would just talk a little bit about this metaphor that you understood about the Nile as this cradle of civilization that disseminated this water falling, justice falling down from a high, wisdom coming down and going into the river valley. So talk a little bit about your understanding of that entire territory and your travels there.
Well, this was a gradual understanding because I didn't know it when I first went there. It probably didn't happen to maybe 10 years after I've been going back and forth. In the old days, and they still do it, I think, on airlines, but I didn't notice it this time on the airline when I flew to Egypt, is that, they have this thing, they show you on the monitor the direction that the plane is going. But when you leave lowland, which I was doing, I was flying from Egypt and Sudan to Ethiopia, I began to notice that there was a topographical map and that the altitude was also being shown, not just the straight vertical line. And it started making me wonder, wow, what does this mean? Because I've been going to Ethiopia. Ethiopians, for those of you who don't know, most of the people in Ethiopia live in mountains. You have the lowlanders, live in a desert-like area, but most of the people live in the highlands. And the highlands start at about 5,000 feet and goes up to about 12. I think Mount Dashin is maybe 15,000 feet. So when you're there, you're there. You don't think, it's not that the land drops off, 100 miles away from you, it doesn't. So I never thought about it in terms of altitude. So then that particular year when it hit me that there's an altitude issue, I went to start researching, looking for topographical maps of East Africa. And that's when I discovered this Nile Trench. And that's what, and in the back of my mind, which was not something that was really taking up much attention, was the question about the Nile is the only river that goes north. All other rivers go south. And why is it, so in Egypt, because the Nile goes north to the Mediterranean, when you're navigating a ship, you don't really need sails to go to the Mediterranean. You just use the current of the river. But to go back up, you catch the wind of the Mediterranean, which is it's amazing how the Almighty has figured out stuff for us. So that's when I found the topographical map, and I commissioned a cartographer to come and let's put the numbers on this. And so that was my discovery of why the Nile goes north, because it's falling downhill. Now there's something else that came then another 10 years later is why is it that most of the water, 85% of the water that reaches Egypt comes out of Ethiopia, Lake Tana, and the Blue Nile. But there's a White Nile as well, and the White Nile comes out of what's called Lake Victoria, the river states, which would be down here somewhere, which is much bigger. But then I discovered there's a very interesting phenomenon. The White Nile, well, white here, gets stuck into a 500-mile swamp before it gets to Khartoum. And this swamp slows that water down, and because it's slowed down in a hot climate, that water evaporates. Years later, I learned that was transpiring, because some plants do that at night. When they get too much water, they'll transpire. So this water evaporates, goes up and become clouds. Those clouds then go east to the Ethiopian highlands and fall for 2 months straight on Ethiopia. That water is then what is collected into the Lake Tana and becomes the Blue Nile. So, this water. Yeah. This is one of the tributaries to that water in Bahar Dar, which is the place about 15 miles from there is where the Blue Nile falls. And this is a morning light, the morning mist. This is, to me, the spirit of the water, the spirit of the earth, mixed with the spirit of the light. Because, as you begin to appreciate how the Egyptians understood life, is that not only are the whole big drama is nature. We survive because the candle of heaven is above us. And that candle of heaven is the reason why we have water, we have a life, we have atmosphere, everything. If that candle goes out for a week, then earth will begin to shut down. So the Egyptians appreciated, one, that candle. They appreciated the perfection of the Creator, that all those candles, the moons and whatever, the two eyes of the sky, they do not collide. That there is a divine balance in nature. So what they tried to do is they realized that divine balance in nature is something that with human behavior can go askew at times. But they tried to create then, they had the spiritual people had to deal with the problem, how do we create some sort of thing that the humans will recognize and reckon with that will allow us to replicate the divine balance of the Almighty on earth. And that's what from what I can tell so far, and looking at what's left behind, that's what the ancient Egyptians was obsessed with.
So another topic that I want to hear you talk about is this issue of identity, right? And that you grew up in Jim Crow South, Tuskegee University, but then starting in the 70s, began to have a deep relationship with Egypt and Africa that profoundly transformed your sense of who you are in society and who Black Americans are in the world. Like you wrote, slavery is not our history, slavery is an interruption to our history. So I'd love to hear you talk about how your first travels to Egypt and Africa transformed how you saw yourself as a citizen of the world, a citizen of religion, of spirituality, and your sense of self.
Well, my understanding of Africa came from the time I was at Tuskegee. Because at Tuskegee we had, and we still do, we have a lot of advanced degree students who are Africans, mostly studying in the sciences, whether that's chemistry or veterinary medicine or what have you. And I began to make friends with these students. And they then, in turn, I was attracted to their music. And from their music and getting to know them and hanging out with them, they then began to expose me to the writings of African leaders. At the time, most of them were what we call freedom fighters, Kwame Nkrumah, Ezekwe, and Haile Selassie. So that began to help, to my mind, emotionally make a connection with that Africans or our cousins. And at the same time, I felt completely emboldened to do so because I was totally disappointed with what white scholarship have told us about us. Whether that was in popular media with Jungle somebody, or if it was in the descriptions about who we were. I had learned to understand, to reject any conclusions about African people out of the mouths.
You couldn't find meaning in your current culture, but when you went to Africa, you could really find deep meaning about who you truly were.
Absolutely. Because, the first obvious thing I said to people, well, I went to Africa, and first time I was nervous though, because I said, maybe the enemies of black people are right. Maybe I'm gonna get there and I'm gonna see this and this and this. Didn't happen. But what did happen right away that made me comfortable was the red clay, the red earth, because red earth is what I grew up around. And then what made me comfortable was the fact that I had people were very receptive, and I could melt into the environment. I found it quite liberating that I did not stick out. And not only did I not stick out, but I didn't become a target on my back because I stuck out. I became a part of the majority. Normalization was me, as opposed to living in our society, where I am a target and normalization is not my color. So this was a very attractive thing. And so I realized that, hey, what I'm around with now are all my cousins. I saw them as an extended family. Not necessarily brothers, but cousins. And that was fine. And my cousins responded to me the way I responded to them. I learned to appreciate the fact that here was a mirror image, and not only a mirror image, but mirror behavior that I could relate to, that just there again reinforced my sense of normalization. So I kept going back every year. I tell people that going to Africa yearly was cheaper than therapy.
Can you tell us what we're looking at here and how, is this a cousin of yours?
Yeah. A ghost of a cousin. But this is, I photographed this mummy back in '99. This is the Mummy of King Tut.
And how old is it? 3,500
years. Now he was discovered 100 years ago, so that makes him 3,600 years. So for 3,500 years, what I appreciate about this is that the Egyptians essentially had, we have this thing called a military-industrial complex. I think they had the mortuary-industrial complex. And the priesthood, you see these paintings on the walls of the tombs, how the priesthood spent so much time trying to take care to prepare the body for the next life. And this King Tut, the preparation of him is just amazing. And the survival of the body was important to them. But this person has been on his way to eternity for 3,600 years.
Didn't you have to sneak in early in the morning to take this photo?
Well, sneak I would not like to use. Yeah, I had to do it on the, See, I found out in Egypt there's a lot of things that are, not allowed, but it's not forbidden.
Yes.
So, I went early, my wife and I went very early. They opened the tombs and temples at 6:30 in the morning, but most tourists have breakfast, so they get there at 9. So we went very early, and just as the guard opened up, and we went in, and I talked to my fixer to see if he could make it talk in Arabic, to make an arrangement that if he allowed, but no cameras were not permitted. So I could not take my camera in. So I was just stuck with my iPhone. And so the guard knew that I was interested in the mummy, so he took a little light, a pencil light, and he lit it up, and I said, oh, fine. But I had another little light in my pocket I wanted to use instead. And he knew that if he cooperated with me, that he would get a tip afterwards. So, but if anybody else was in the tomb, this was impossible.
Right.
So we had to do it before anybody else arrived. And this was, 10 minutes in and out. And having, it's good that I had prior experience with mummies, so I knew how I wanted to do it. I thought it through. One of the things I learned from my second mentor from Look Magazine, Arthur Rothstein, who taught me visual linguistics, is that you should always pre-visualize what you're gonna do before you have to do it. So if your task is to photograph a person, photograph a thing, pre-visualize it, so that when you work through when you start eliminating the visual ideas you come up with, then you're open to look for what else grabs you. But at least you've got a handle on it. So by doing mummies before him, I had a handle. In the book, I have the mummy of Ramses the Great. And I have not his mummy, but I have his golden mask, the wooden mannequin, and then him in one of his golden coffins of eternity. But it's amazing being in those tombs, because those tombs, first of all, they were not meant for people to ever see again. All the artwork that were involved, all of the handling that were involved.
Well, and to be in a space where you know that there were people doing this work
Yes.
3,600 years ago.
Right.
It's very profound
And
to be in
those-
spaces that are that ancient.
And those artists were the spiritual artists that you were talking
Right.
about. They were working for the church.
You feel
the
like you
temple.
can sense their presence in a certain way. I feel like those
Yeah.
spaces, they have an embodiment. They have an energy that you can sense, right?
People have invested their spirit in those spaces.
Yeah.
I feel the same way when I go and I photograph ancient churches
Right.
and ancient temples, because there were hundreds of years that people went back and forth and they did ceremony and they invested their spirits into these monuments, into these areas. So when I'm photographing these monuments, I'm looking at what's obvious, but I'm also looking at what the spiritual imprint it has been from the humans who've used it, who've been there, who've exposed themselves, who's presented themselves to the Creator. And that imprint is there. Now this is an interesting picture, because this picture I didn't know what it meant for years, and then I went back and I was able to do it. But this is the view that the Egyptian farmer would have at sunrise in the temple. So the Egyptians were all farmers, and they would hold temple before sunrise, like 4:30 in the morning. And sunrise would be the end of the service, because the end of the service and the sun coming up means that the Almighty has blessed you with a new day. This is your high to take you through the rest of the day. Now, I discovered this by two things. By working in Ethiopia. If you go to Ethiopia, most churches in the daytime are empty, unless there's a special service to a saint or whatever. So I started inquiring about this, and they said, well, I said, where are the people? They said, well, they've already been here, they've gone. I said, what do you mean? When did they come? Well, they come, I'm a tourist, I'm a foreigner, so they were kind of like slow to tell me. Well, they come like 4:30 in the morning. It's like 4:30 in the morning. So sure enough, I go, 4:30 in the morning, the place is crowded. People are praying, people are reading gospel, and when the sun comes up, they leave, which makes sense.
They got work to do.
They got work to do.
It's going to get hot.
So then it made me think of the scripture in the Bible about Jesus being betrayed. And when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he says to the one who betrays him, before the cock crows twice, you would have denied me thrice. Then in Ethiopia, I found out that roosters, they don't wait for the sun to come up to crow. They start before. They start maybe in a half hour to 45 minutes before you see the sun, you hear the rooster. Yes, the rooster does crow when the sun is up, but he starts before.
That's right. So identity and then the ancient connection. One of the next thing I kind of want to talk about, we're going to go a little more quickly through some of these slides because you have so many stories about the specific rituals and traditions and cultures that are both ancient and completely present. So you taught me this phrase, the time before Genesis.
Oh, right.
Right? And so in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the book of Genesis, well, that's the beginning, right? But that goes back to about 6,000 BC, maybe a little
Perhaps.
farther.
Well,
maybe farther, but I was just at the Met yesterday, and some of the oldest religious artifacts go back to 80,000.
Was this the new origin? Was that the origin of African civilization?
Yes, 80,000 BC. That's a really long time.
Right.
That's so much longer between 80,000 and 6 BC than it is from 6,000 BC to where we are now.
Right.
Right. And so how much culture and tradition, art, idea, mythology came before that? And so a lot of the work that you've done looks at these roots of these stories, and how this, a good example. Actually, tell me about who exactly this is, because this is a contemporary image, but it looks completely ancient. I love the iconography of this image. That's one of the things we also talked about, is that images can bypass our verbal thoughts. They can work around argument by just simply lodging themselves as an image, as a concept in your brain. They go almost directly from image to symbol, right? So it can be very powerful as a visual artist to create these images. And so in your work, I mean, that's part of the mission of your life work, is to make these images then present. So can you tell us a little bit about who this is, and then this concept about the time before Genesis?
This woman is in an ancient place, a 13th century churches dug out of the mountain in a place in Ethiopia called Lalibela, that was built in the 13th centuries by King Lalibela, because Ethiopians, Christians, used to pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which is okay until after the 7th century. The 6th century, the Arabs invaded Egypt, and they were, how do I say it? In their missionary zeal, their position with Ethiopian Christians is that you must convert to Islam or you must die. So with so many fatalities of Ethiopians, pilgrims who could not return, King Lalibela decided to create his own New Jerusalem. And they did this by going to the Lasta Mountains. And they did footprints on the mountains of what they want the church footprint to be. Then they dug down 40 feet, giving a 20-foot berth, sometimes 40-foot berth of that center piece. Once they dug out to the bottom, what they left behind, they looked back, and what you have left behind is a mountain, a monolithic mountain, that's a piece of, that now has to be converted into a sculpture. And that sculpture is where you dig out the windows, you dig out the columns, you dig out the interiors. Some of those churches can be entered from the top by steps. Others of those churches can only be entered by tunnels between churches, and this is one of those tunnels.
So this is a Christian pilgrim? Yeah.
This is a Christian pilgrim, and this particular color is a color that's made by the monks, that they didn't sell to people who come. But it's a very, very spiritual place. You would love it. They do this thing, they have all the Orthodox, in the Orthodox faith, they're 2 weeks behind our church, our calendar, because they go by the Georgian calendar, which is not only 2 years behind, but it's 7 years behind too. So in 2022, if you go to Ethiopia, the calendar for the local Ethiopians will be minus 7 years. So if you think that if you're older than you really want to be, just go to Ethiopia, and things will work out. But to talk about the world before Genesis. We didn't really know about the world before Genesis until we start looking at until we start reading the Egyptian glyphs. And that didn't happen to the end of the 18th century. Well, the glyphs are broken by Champollion. From the glyphs, gradually, we have come up with a body of work that allows us to know that what these people were talking about with the things left behind was about their faith and their belief in nature, and their belief in how we're connected. They were essentially Buddhist pacifists, spiritual humanists, when you really look at what it is. This particular religion and these people survived thousands of years. We only know about what they thought from a tomb that was made in 2500 BC, because the line between history and oral tradition is written. So we can go back to 2500 BC, and there are two tombs in Saqqara. One is the tomb of Teti, and this tomb of Unas. And what they have on it is scripture, 300 lines of holy scripture from different books of Egyptian belief. Some the Book of the Dead, some of the Book of, which is also the Book of Coming Forward by Day, some of the Book of the Gates, Book of the Moon, Book of Tomorrow. In these books, they talk about many different spiritual principles. Now, out of those books, and if you have later on in the coffin text, we have chapters that came, the chapter 125. And chapter 125 is about how the soul can migrate to the next world.
Right, the concept of the soul itself really precedes Christianity to Africa, to Egyptian culture, and they very much, and the eternal nature of the soul, like all of those concepts came from Egyptian.
Every theological concept that we have came out of the Egyptian.
Tell us about the importance. I want to talk a little bit about the divine feminine and how incredibly present and important that was in Egyptian faith. So then in the Abrahamic religions with Christianity and Judaism, they became very patriarchal, and really they adopted some of the myths, but they kind of shaved off all the parts relating to the divine feminine. So tell the story about this ancient mother and the story of, is it Horus, as the base myth for then the virgin birth. It's a wonder, it's like a straight line of how they take an old story, refigure it a little bit, and it becomes part of a new archetype.
This story grows out of the story, the paradigm of the Holy Family. And Egyptian walls and tombs.
Is this the one that's at the Met?
No, but they have one.
They have one similar,
and Brooklyn Museum has a better one.
Sorry, go ahead.
That's calcite. But it comes from the story of the Holy Family. In Egypt, in Egyptian religion, you have the Holy Family. You have this son, you have the father, the son, and the mother. In patriarchal religion, the mother disappeared into whoof and became a ghost. And so in the Holy Family, you have the reason, because you can't have a family without a mother. So in the Holy Family, the story is that her husband was killed, Ast, or as we know her as Isis. She pleaded with the spirits of the Almighty to find a way to make his life continue to live. She was able to get the support of the spirit, and she hovered and transformed herself into a bird. And she hovered over the body of her dead husband, and she took his seed, and her seed impregnated her. 9 months later, she gives birth to this child. That is the first, that's impossible. It's just as impossible as Joseph not having sex with Mary.
And it's a so much more active story than the, Immaculate Conception, where Mary, the vessel, is just the benign receiver of this grace, as opposed to the agent of her own direction.
And she is the figure behind the throne. The throne cannot exist without her. Her glyph, she is a throne figure. So then this son grows up, but before he grows up, he's a baby, And they are both fugitives in this land because his uncle has
That
killed
sounds
his
so
father.
familiar too. Okay.
So as they're growing up, the mother and this child who are fugitives have to make a living. The mother really has no skills other than rulership. So she has to now go and work in the marketplace. But if she appears with a child, the police will notice and they may single her out. So what she does in the daytime, she can't get a babysitter, so she makes a little basket, a boat basket made out of papyrus, and she puts
I
the
thought
sun.
that was Moses.
This is thousands of years before Moses. This is the paradigm. This is the story. The problem with living is that you know nothing past now, so you always got to copy stuff. So she puts the baby in this basket, leave him in the marsh, and when she comes back, she can collect him. This is where that story comes from. So now the story of her and the possible child is recreated in the patriarch faith. But they don't tell the whole story because the patriarch faith fundamentally wanted to deny the divinity of the woman. In the Egyptian faith of nature, the woman, if you look at Egyptian faith, it starts off with a man, Antum, who comes under the sun. But the Egyptians, who were the first people to have a dialogue with the spirit world, not only realized that their strongest force in nature is the sun, the lamp of heaven.
The sun in the sky.
The sun in the sky. But, which they call the canopy. But the sun is not really the force, is not God. Is not the force of God. The force of God is hidden. Yes, the sun, like God, is far away from us. It's above us. We can't reach it. But what we see manifested in the sunlight is not God. God is what is the force behind the sun.
Right, so they talk about the worshiping the sun, but that really is a simplification of the concept.
It's a simplification. They're right. They look like they worship the sun. But in their mind, the sun was merely the window upon the residence of God. So the God they call Amen. Have you heard that word before?
I've heard that word before.
That's the name of the Egyptian God.
That's right.
Amen. Yeah. Now, Amen is part of the function of the night sky, night space. Now, who makes up night? There's a figure that makes up night space. It is and they symbolize this in a painting, in a drawing. You may have seen this. It's an image of a lean woman leaning downward dog over the planet.
All right.
Not north and south, but the equatorial planet. Equatorial poles, the way the sun moves. Mm-hmm. She stretches over the planet, and she stretches her arms go to the west, where the sun sets, so that the sun can then use her arms as a runway up into her mouth. It enters her body where she then recharges it overnight. And because she wears her dress that has holes in it, we see the twinkling of the light of the sun as it passes through her body at night. And then because her feet are on the eastern horizon, the sun is born each day. Mm-hmm. So that image is several things. The image of continuity, that sunrise that the worshipers are looking for every morning, and also saying that heaven is the body of an African woman.
Well, and that life travels through the sacred feminine.
Which is, how could you do Christian religion with no life traveling through this?
Where in Genesis, they simply talk about God separated the light and the darkness, and God is in the darkness and God is in the light. But it is all within this large patriarchal culture, and it separates. It does not embrace this richness of the balance of masculine and feminine with the balance of light and dark. It's really a simplification.
I agree with you, because with the Egyptian, everything was about balance, ma'at, light and day. But there's something else that you got to think about. In the patriarch religion, the man put all the sin on the woman. Not only did she lose her divinity, but she became guilty of everything. And like a rapist, he walks away free.
Well, one of the things that's still true is it's very hard to be a single mother. Yep. So these images of the sacred feminine, it really is very inspiring, as we, I think, in contemporary society, think about our Christian faith and how it has been part of this patriarchal culture. And how do we create a more holistic vision? And I think we see this in the wisdom from Egypt.
And in my book, I even talk about my wife. We write about the Temple of the Woman, which is holistic, which is nature.
I think we need to. So tell us briefly about the Temple of the Woman. We're going to take a few more minutes looking at some of these specific rituals. But what is the Temple of the Woman? And
it's where women worship their divinity. No men are allowed. And the only reason I was allowed, because I knew the woman who taught me so much about the Oromo religion, the nature religion that mirrors the Egyptian, had done her PhD on it, is that she wanted people to know, and it was because of her taking me to these places that I could photograph some of the things. Couldn't stay long after the ceremony started, but I was able to show that they exist.
Right.
And in this particular one among the Borgia people in Ethiopia, I was really struck by the fact that two things. They have the separate house, but in part of that house, they keep cattle. They keep cows. Cows go back to Hathor. Cows go back in the nativity scene. There must be a cow. Cow represents mother.
True.
In the middle of this thing, and then there's a place where they burn offerings, incense. But in the middle was this humongous piece of wood. It must have been 3 feet wide, about 6 inches thick, and about 7 feet high. And from like the 4.5 feet up, where you can reach, there are cow udders. 4 cow udders are sculptured into this wood. The high point of this seance, or the feeling that these women experience in this, incense burning and the twirling and their calling upon the mother in themselves, is that they then fling themselves against these udders. All of it is an amplification of their womanness.
Well, it represents sacred nourishment, right?
Yes, it is the sacred nourishment. It's the nourishment that gives you life.
Right.
So here they had normalized their agency to worship themselves. Not only as women, but worship themselves as women, as mothers, as nourishers, as foundation stones of life.
Yeah.
And that was the Temple of the Woman.
Amazing. So we see here how ever present so much of the ancient culture is in the life of Africa. And so your work, this book, is completely fascinating with all of this ancient symbol, ancient wisdom, but then showing how it is very much alive today. Like, you want to tell them about the mantles here?
Well, the sacred sign for a priest in ancient Egypt was to wear the leopard skin.
Like the mantle that he's wearing right here on the...
And he's wearing that, and you see the head of the leopard up there. And he's holding it because now he's doing a chant. He's doing a chant to the spirit of the ancestors to protect his tomb. I've always had the very interesting feeling about tombs, is that we look at them as how they're written towards us. But what is to say that the priests were creating a spiritual wall of protection. And I only thought about this when there was a project, there was a tomb I did in Sudan, and this English woman got in touch with me, and she says, well, I try to do tombs in sort of 3-dimensional, and I went to your tomb, the tomb you went to, but my pictures are not as good. Would you loan me some pictures? I said, sure, let me see what you do. So what was interesting is that she took essentially the tomb out of the stone and made it a translucent thing. Only in seeing it in a translucent shape do you get an appreciation that maybe the priests themselves were making a protective wall that the spirits around it could see, because look, King Tut existed for 3,500 years without being disturbed.
Right, and it is very much a protective wall.
Very much a protective wall.
Yeah.
And we don't know about the other ones. They've found 62. They know that there's 100 and some odd
Yeah.
that are still enjoying this protection that the priests who understood the spirit world were able to develop. These guys.
And these are Ethiopian
So
Christian,
the Ethiopian
right?
Christians.
But even whether it's Christian or even Muslim, right, and this, that they keep these Egyptian rituals and traditions have been fully integrated in a lot of ways
Right.
into whether, it's
Well,
called a Christian church, but it's like it's very different from an American Christian church.
Yes, we call that syncretism. They have been able to syncretize these elements and keep going. Well, African people had to do that in slavery, especially in South America. In Brazil, where you have very strong Santeria
Right.
or what is it called? Macum, what is it? Candomblé. So what they would do to keep their memory of their culture alive is that they would have these processions on white Christian holidays.
Right.
So that outwardly the slave owners thought that they were worshiping Jesus Christ when there may be colors among their fabrics or other things that to them said no, they were worshiping Obatala or da-da-da-da-da.
Right.
So by syncretism, they were able to keep the memory going. It happened in Voodoo. So here
Resilience.
we've taken in the place of the people who decided that they were going to make it
The opposition religion.
the opposition religion. Look at the first problem in Moses. They wanted to worship the cow. Well, it was emotionally comfortable for them. They knew that. So you can't get rid of everything. Sunday, why is Sunday?
Because of Amen.
Because of Amen. It's the sun. So over time, people won't realize what those connections mean. But in the beginning, those connections were important to bring the people to a different place.
Right. So we're going to open it up to questions in a few minutes. I just want to ask you one more question about sort of sacred rituals and what are some of the things that you do as an artist to, whether it's a daily practice, to keep yourself connected to to keep yourself inspired, keep yourself connected to a higher power? Like, what are the things that you do as an artist to feed your soul?
Well, the first thing I do is that we all get our 2 blessings in the morning when our eyes open. I think about...
Is one for each eye? Okay.
I'm grateful for being able to live, but I'm grateful also to be able to witness. And so I just try to keep in touch, get rid of myself, and just keep in touch with the drama of life that's going on. I try not to be judgmental about it. I know it's all an experience that we're trying to get through, and I hope I get through it without, I hope I live to die in my sleep and I get blown up or something like that. But life is a very interesting thing. The reality, existence is a very interesting thing. I love, I love my jazz. I love astronomy. I love reading, and I love the happiness of being in a relationship that's happy. But all of it is about keeping centered. It's just keeping centered and not taking yourself too serious, but trying to accept and appreciate what's going on around you.
You have to have a certain quiet, right, in your spirit in order to feel that moment when the bow and the target connect, right?
In fact, I like to be quiet. And that's one of the reasons I used to go to the desert, because I love people, but I like to know I can get away from them. And in the desert, you can see people coming 10 miles away. So that you can...
You got some time to plan.
You have some time to lie down.
Get your mind ready.
Yeah, so that they can't see you.
Do you meditate?
Yeah, meditation is important. That was a time I did journal. I wrote a journal. But, that was I don't do it that regular, but whenever there's a crisis or something that's really sort of monumental, it's good to write it because one, it reminds you that it really happened, and two, it unloads your memory so that you don't have to go over and over and over again.
And life keeps going by and more things keep happening, so
And-
I find
and
that writing them down becomes really helpful.
Yeah, and life is like water, you can't hold it.
No,
It
and you
keeps
can't
going.
step in the same river twice. It just flows on by.
I don't know about stepping in the same river twice, but you can't step in the same water twice.
That's right. So I want to open it up to questions. If there's people in the audience who have questions, I'd love to hear from you. There are microphones at the end of the pews here, and honestly, it will help the people who are watching online if you will walk over to the microphone and ask your questions. I'm going to invite you to do that now. If you are watching online, I'm going to look for your questions on on chat.fpc.church. Hi, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear it? Great. Good afternoon, Chester. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing all the things that you've seen. I've learned more than I ever imagined just by listening for the last hour. In the age of Instagram and TikTok and Twitter and all the social media, has that, and going from film to digital, has that at all shaped how you photograph, other than maybe changing your camera equipment, or do you still shoot with film? Have you been shaped at all by social media and the advances in the technology of photography? Has it changed your process at all?
No, not really. It gets back to, and I say no, and I'll tell you why. My first mentor taught me when I had my first camera, and I saw in a magazine that, wow, there's a certain picture you can make with this lens and that lens. And I went off to buy that lens. I had saved money. And I made the mistake of going by my mentor's house to tell him how proud I was to go buy this lens. And he said, stop right there. I said, well, what's the problem? It's new technology, right? He says, no lens and no camera can make a picture. Only your eye can make a picture. It's a tool. You in control of the tool, not the other way around. TikTok, any of those things, they get what I'm producing. I'm not trying to produce for them. I'm trying to get it out of me. And it translates into a two-dimensional thing as an electronic file, but that's not why I understand what I do. I understand myself. So to me, it's a tool to distribute, to communicate, to reach another audience. And it's interesting finding out sometimes I play with it. Sometimes I take an image and I'll put it on one media platform and another media platform, and I didn't notice how many hits do I get overnight on different platforms, because there are different age groups, there are different interests, what have you, but I try to reach out. And that's why I did books, always trying to reach out. This is something I feel that's inside of me. I think all artists have the same thing. We all try to create, but it's an internal conversation that we're having with ourselves that then produces this creation. We have no idea how other people are going to respond to it until they actually see it or experience it.
I find that with this proliferation of social media and the internet in general, we are in a profoundly more visual era. Mm-hmm. And so these images that are powerfully iconographic and mm-hmm. frankly communicate an idea simply, mm-hmm. right? Like the mummy's head of Tutankhamun, the mm-hmm. alabaster female, right? These iconographic images really proliferate well. And so I don't know if you're finding that, but I'm definitely finding that in my relationship to the work that I do on social media, the power of a simple iconographic image that communicates clearly, the composition is simple, that's what's powerful. And honestly, I've kind of learned through that process what connects.
She said a very important word, simple. It has to be simple. It has to look even easy the simpler, the more effective, stronger, because the simplicity comes from your being able to, for the artist also, to melt that down into its essence. So when it reaches that level of essence and simplicity, then boom. Oh, there was somebody over here.
Thank you.
Yes, hi. Thank you.
It's not on.
I can speak loud.
They'll turn it on.
Hello, hello? All right. I just want to say thank you, especially with your shout out to the social studies teacher. That was one of your mentors. I wonder, it seems like a lot of your work historically, and this is all brilliant, has been to demonstrate the humanity and dignity of black people, especially in the United States. Thank you. All right. To demonstrate the humanity and dignity of black people in the United States. I'm wondering how you see over your lifetime if the images that we are seeing in the media have changed at all, and if so, how, or not? Are we still kind of stuck in stereotypical kind of mass media images of black people, or has that changed?
Very good question. The reason I picked up a camera in 1967 is I went to this old man's house, photographer's house, and to get some, because I had hired him to do a job for the student newspaper. And he was late getting the prints. And I had to wait for him to make the process to film even and get the prints. What I discovered behind a curtain were these old pictures made during the Depression of farmers. And it made me realize I'd seen these people before. They were my great uncles and aunts in my farm town of Alabama. But as a student, I didn't have money to hire him to go make pictures of them. But I wanted them to have a picture on their wall, because on their wall was only a farmer's almanac and maybe a picture of Jesus Christ. And I did not want them to die without having their picture on their wall. So that's what caused me to pick up a camera. Then 6 months, a year later, I'm going on civil rights demonstrations in Montgomery against we're protesting a guy named George Wallace. And when we come back to campus and we look at the paper the next day and look at the news that same night, the image of us is not of American citizens petitioning the government. The image of us is that of potential rapists, thuggists, and arsonists, which taught me a couple of things. That one, yes, those images were not new. We had been raised with those images where you only saw a picture of a black person if they were a suspected felon or a prostitute. But now with a camera, it made me realize what these people who have cameras, what they can do. It taught me also that a camera never lies about the photographer. If you hate what you're looking at, you will project that hate. If you fear what you're looking at, you will project that fearness. So then I began to think about this a little more, and I began to analyze what was really missing in the image of the black person in American media. And to me, those came out to be three issues: the issues of decency, the issue of dignity, and the issue of virtuous character. So I made it a point, having now come to that realization, hooking up my love for photography because of my heart for my family, I hitched it up to a political agenda. And those two agendas, that love of my people and that political agenda, is really what's driven my work. So when I became a photographer for the Times, that was perfect. The Spirit put me in the right place, because now I had a chance to influence the decision makers of America. I cannot eliminate those other pictures that they see. I cannot eliminate the fact that Dartmouth shows their students Birth of a Nation as informational, but I can add something else to the landscape so that people will see something that they never thought of before, that will connect them to the humanity of the people who are their neighbors next door that they would never had a reason to think about. So this year, I'm getting a Lifetime Achievement Award from the retired New York City media editors. And someone made the research of looking back on my pictures, and they say 40% of my pictures were of black people over my 38 years at the paper. I made a point to photograph black people. I wanted to photograph black people because I wanted them to benefit from how I saw them. And then one of my mentors was Gordon Parks, a photographer. And when I first met Gordon, I think it was in '71, Gordon said, well, what do you want to do? I said, well, Gordon, I don't like the image of my people. This is what I want to do. So in the end, Gordon says, okay, I'm glad you feel that way. And if that's how you feel, when you get an assignment for an editor, and the roll of film has 36 exposures on it, if you make 35 the way you feel, and you make a mistake and make the 36 the way they have been taught, then that's the one they're going to use. So he said, don't give them a choice.
I have a question from our chat from another elder, Jim Johnson, who's also a photographer, and he asks, as I listen, I wonder whether your sense of your craft has moved from bearing witness to prophecy.
I can understand that. In a way, I guess some people could see it that way. I think the prophecy, I'm bearing witness. The prophecy, I think is a function of the distribution of the work, not the making of the work. The work is what it deserves, but I think it's the distribution is what may think is prophecy. If I'm understanding prophecy, I don't know.
I hope that your sense, my sense, is that this work is arriving at a moment where culture is really eager and ready to hear it and needs to hear it.
Okay, so I've been working in the wilderness.
Right.
And now it's my time to bring this forth. Yes. Yeah. Well, this book took 50 years of work. In fact, in 20 years I had to throw away. And the reason I tell you this, I used to, because all photographers think that black and white is the mother, is a pure way to go. So from 73 to 93, I photographed in Egypt in black and white. And then my son, who was being a real hard head with his mother, we were divorced. She couldn't speak, they weren't communicating well. So I decided that year when I was going to Ethiopia and Egypt, I would take him with me. And because he can't speak Amharic in Ethiopia and he couldn't speak Arabic in Egypt, he had to talk to me. So one day we're out photographing and my son says to me, he said, well, Dad, why are you photographing this in black and white? The colors are so rich and blah, 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 blah. So I had this immediate urge to strangle him, but I let it go because, what he's saying is, 20 years, I've been working on this kid for 20 years. What are you talking about? You're trashing my work. But I began to think about, maybe he has a point, that I would reach more people of his generation and even my generation if they could have a fuller visual experience of what they're looking at. So then I started over shooting in color.
The color is inescapably present, right? Whereas we can look at black and white photos and we might admire the composition, they might be very powerful, but you can distance yourself from them and say that's documentary, that's historical. Yep. Whereas an image like this, by virtue of its intensity of chroma, the tightness of the photo, the quality of images has increased, it feels absolutely present. And so your entire book is full of images that really make you realize that this so-called ancient tradition is very much an eternal present that's very connected to my everyday world, but yet I knew nothing of it. Do we have one more question, maybe from the audience? And then yes, please.
Hello. I wanted to ask, you were raised in a church, you were even a preacher as a child.
Wait, okay, you have to take your mask off.
Okay.
The thing
You were
is-
raised in a church,
Yes,
and you were a preacher, you said, as a
Yes.
child.
yes.
So I'm interested now, after all you've learned about other religions, specifically when we were talking about religions where the feminine was seen as divine and then it was taken out in the patriarchal religions, how do you do religion now?
Okay, very, very valid question. I'm spiritual, not religious. I believe and I love and support every religion. If you go through this book, you will not find anything that's judgmental about anybody's religion. I am completely in support of anybody who spends whatever time during the week or the month to make themselves better people. That's my feeling.
Any other questions from our audience here? We have a comment from...
Another one? Okay. Oh, thank you.
We have one more question on the chat about your comment about being bifocal, right? And seeing things on different levels. If at all, does that relate to Du Bois' idea of the African-American double consciousness?
Well, yes and no. I mean, it's a stretch. First of all, let me say, in answer to that, I see faith community as one thing. Faith community may not see itself as one thing, but I see it as one thing. Now, the bifocal and the double consciousness of Du Bois. Du Bois is talking about the reality of how living as black as a minority in a dominant culture where we are not accepted forces us to accept and be cognizant always of rejection. And that rejection means that we are not welcome at the party, so to speak. But as a human, we have to find a way not to be depressed and survive caught up in that mix. So we have this code switching. We have a whole lot of things of skills that we've developed about how do we survive, but at the same time, how do we maintain who we are while we're asking that question, who are we? And our enemy around us is telling us that we're nothing. But we ourselves know that somehow innately we must be something. We're God's children. Even when we find out that the Bible that we are worshiping for, that the slave master gave us, is a King James missionary slave Bible. There are 67 passages in the Bible that approve of slavery.
Right.
Now, we may like the Moses story because it's about overcoming oppression and being justified to be free. And there's a lot of stuff that's sprinkled because it all came out of the Egyptian in nature. So the Bible I see is a book of 3 books, and I'm not sure if my people separated in their minds like this or anybody. You have the book of the Spirit, you have the book of religion, and you have the book of politics. The book of politics is no good for us. We cling to the book of religion and the book of spirituality because that is echoing what is in our DNA, what has come from before that we have no idea where exactly it came from, which I hope my work is trying to give an expression of. So I even say, look, I love the whole faith community is one thing, and I look at the shortcomings of human things always have shortcomings because we humans, I think, are flawed fundamentally. But that's why we have biblical stuff to try to direct us. I think that the faith of opposition, the Abrahamic faith, is, to me, if I had to think of the family of faith, is merely book 2, Hebrew, book 3, Christian, book 4, Islam. Book 1 is the book of Amen, that it all come from. Book 1 is the one that we are now just beginning to see how they express themselves, is the one that should be reconstituted, and so then that the whole family of religion, of faith, is complete.
I think we are all wrestling in this time with how we take this living Christian tradition that we are a part of, and yet write a new book, because there are so many ways in which this book does not serve us as women, as Black people in society, as artists, as poor people, as, fill in your blank.
We need book one. It's not about oppression.
Right.
And it's about acceptance, about the full measure and agency of women. Because now what we have and what's happened in the faith community is it's been so corrupted that you have people whose mouths are full of scripture, but their hearts are full of hate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Something's wrong. There's an imbalance.
Well, Chester Higgins, thank you for speaking to us from your profound experiences of faith, of seeking spirit in this world, of embodying it for us and giving it to us to see and to experience and understand our own connection to this ancient tradition. It's very meaningful to be given a larger view of our sense of self in this world and of spirit in this world. So thank you for your time today and for sharing all of your wisdom with us.
Thank you.
So Chester's book is available, and he has signed copies, so everyone is welcome to stay and get a copy and say hello.
Thank you.
It was a great pleasure. I feel like I could do this for a while.